I'm going to do a little bit of a small review about interwoven timelines. The topic is about the different ways that Jewish history crosses the history of other nations. Right? And we selected to start with Purim because it is really one of the major intersections that exist with Babylon, with Assyria, with Media, and of course with Persia. Right? And also because we have about 5 or 6 weeks to Purim, and I think we will cover all of it by then, hopefully. And hopefully it'll give us new insights into Purim as we go forward. So one of the most critical points that is often overlooked in the Purim story is Purim is very Shushan-centric. Right? That is to say, it seems to be the story of the Jews in the diaspora, as though there's nothing else going on in the world. Right? And the entire world is within the Persian Empire. But there is another capital city in which there's a great deal going on, and it's Jerusalem, which is part of the Persian Empire, but previous to Achashverosh, King Koresh, the Emperor Koresh, Cyrus, had sent the Jews home. He said that God had come to him and said the temple should be rebuilt, and that all those who wished to return from Babylon to rebuild the temple should return. They returned with Zerubbabel, who functioned as a governor on behalf of Koresh, and they began the rebuilding of the temple. At the same time, the Purim story is unfolding. Now, one might ask the question, where are the references in the Purim story to what's going on in Jerusalem? And it's an important question because it has certain parallels to our own history, in the sense that when we read about the Jews of Babylon at the time of Achashverosh, they seem very prosperous. You know, the life is good for them. They're in Shushan, the capital. They're very active there. They're connected with the politicians there, and they're guests at the imperial banquet. There's a special banquet of 7 days put aside just for them. And what is it like for the Jews in Jerusalem? Terrible. Awful. They're constantly being attacked. They're impoverished. They're selling their families into slavery in order to buy food. Things are very, very bad in Jerusalem, both from a point of view of security and from a point of view of economy. And at the same time, the Jews in Shushan seem to have very little concern about this. We see very little mention of it in the story. Now, the Gemara does raise a question.
Who ruled Jerusalem at that time?
Persia.
And
Persia.
Shushan?
Shushan is the capital of Persia.
So it's still the same entity, the same state rules both provinces.
That's right. That's right. And the emperor prior in our history, the emperor prior to Achashverosh was Cyrus. And Cyrus, it says, the Gemara says that Cyrus was anointed with the same oil David was. That he was anointed king of Persia with the same oil that David was. And that he was in fact Mashiach. That he was, that he had sent the Jews back to rebuild the temple. That he was a redeemer. But there's a question that's asked, and the Gemara addresses this question. Right? The Gemara asks the question: what was the cause? What was the cause of the? This is all the things in Gemara are from Gemara Megillah. That makes sense, being that's what it is about. The Gemara asks the question, why were the Jews condemned as a nation to be destroyed? By Haman. What was the cause that God allowed this to happen? Right? It's a very serious condemnation, right? And it gives a strange answer. It says because they went to the feast of Achashverosh. That's why, right? Now, it seems to me that going to the feast of Achashverosh, which we hold was entirely kosher. Everything in it was kosher. Everything was prepared in a kosher way, right? So it wasn't a question of eating non-kosher food. What was the reason that this was such a serious crime? And the reason that it was such a serious crime was you're feasting while your brothers are trying with their bare hands to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And that's where your mind is? You know, making political deals with the king, schmoozing? And you're not thinking about Yerushalayim? What does it say about Jerusalem, right? That my tongue will cleave to my mouth, that my right hand will lose its use. Should I forget Jerusalem? And here they are, 70 years later, in the midst of the opulence of the palace. Right?
And they were,
right?
Is it, I'm correct?
And
they were using the...
I'm coming to it. In the midst of the opulence of the palace, and the description, as we said last week, of the feast of Achashverosh is written in a way that is intended to remind you of the temple. The fabrics that are used, the marble that is used, the colors of the fabrics, the intertwining of the fabrics, are all references to the building of the Beis Hamikdash as well. Right? Perhaps the biggest dramatic difference is, in one case, it's a very holy structure. In another case, it's almost obscene in terms of, well, it is obscene, actually. What does the king say? He says, have my wife come and dance with only her crown on her head.
Right.
You should see how beautiful she is. Right?
Vashti.
Only her crown on her head. And Vashti refuses. Right? But she refuses for her own reasons. But more than that, the drinking and the eating and the just engaging in appetites is exactly the opposite of what the Beis Hamikdash was intended to be. So it's as though the author of the Megillah is saying to us in these opening chapters, right, something was forgotten. Something very big was forgotten. Yes?
Do subjects have a right to or ability to refuse invitation?
Okay, so first of all, Mordechai did, and he told everybody else that they should refuse it, right? But he was the only one who did. Generally speaking, it doesn't seem out of fear that they came. It seems that they came more out of business. That, you know, when they have a party in Ottawa, those people who want contracts with the federal government show up. You know, when they have an event in Washington, you know, the big pipelines and the oil companies, they show up and help fund the event usually. You know, the Jews of Shushan wanted to make deals. That's why they went, right? And the Rabbi told them not to go, specifically. That this was not a place to go.
Not to go to the feast.
Not to go, right? And it wasn't because of kashrus. You know, we always like to think it's because of kashrus. It wasn't because of kashrus. But his concern, it seems, was, first of all, do you honor such a person, you know, as Achashverosh, right? You might argue that you do, that there's nothing particularly wrong with that as long as he doesn't think he's a god. You pay respect to a non-Jewish king, right? But the other issues were, and we'll get to this very specifically, was what were they drinking out of, right? And at this point, you should know that Ezra sends a letter, or a letter is sent. It's in the book of Ezra. It says, to King Artaxerxes, who was Achashverosh, most people hold, your servants and the men of the provinces beyond the river of the Kenneth, Let it come to the king's attention that the Jews who came up from your region to ours have reached Jerusalem and are now rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are completing its walls and reinforcing its foundations. Now the king must realize that when this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, they will stop paying tribute, poll tax, excise tax, and so the royal revenue will be diminished. Now, because we feel obliged to preserve the palace, and because it would not be fitting to see the king dishonored, we have written to advise the king of this matter, so that you may search the records of your forefathers and find in the records and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and states. Insurrection has been rife there since the earliest of times, and being the very reason the city was destroyed, right, by Nebuchadnezzar. We hereby inform the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be that you will no longer have a colony beyond the river. So this is a letter that was written by the enemies of the Jews.
Do you know who it was?
There's a long list. This is. I'll read it to you just for fun, right? Rechum the rhetorician, Shimshai the scribe, wrote a letter concerning Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes, as recorded below. Then the letter was sent in the name of Rechum the rhetorical, Shimshai. Okay, and here we go. Apharsicanites, the Tarpalites, the Apharsites, the Archivites, the Babylonians, the Shushan Kahanites, and the Elamites, and other peoples whom the great and glorious Napar deported and settled into the cities of Samaria and the other provinces beyond the river, as well as the people of Keaneth. This was the text of the letter, and it is what follows, right? So there were a lot of people that Sanherib, remember the Assyrian, right? They moved the populations around, right? So they repopulated what was Israel with non-Jews when they took the Jews to Babylon, right? So this switch was made, right? And it's those people who are complaining about the return of the Jews, right? Nobody really wants Jews to return anywhere, actually. That's our history.
Coming a little bit back. At the feast, they served from the dishes, from the cups, from Bet HaMikdash.
Yes.
No,
that's right.
Jews drank from these cups?
I'm not sure.
It's very hard for me to think that Jews did this.
I'm not sure, but you should know that this is a very, very important point that you're raising, and you raised it as well, is that, and I was coming to it, is part of the harshness of this whole issue is that while the Jews were trying to build the Beis HaMikdash in spite of this kind of behavior, right? This letter came, right, not at the beginning of the rebuilding of it, but a couple of years into it, where the neighbors got very nervous. But they were constantly attacking, setting traps, all kinds of stuff going on, right? It was very ugly. But what do we understand? If they were doing that there, and the Persian emperor was dressed as the Kohen Gadol, right? He was dressed as a Kohen Gadol for this event. It was a big costume party. Yeah. In the big day kahuna of the...
Why was he dressed like a Kohen Gadol?
For the same reason he was serving from the
he was wearing the actual garments of the Kohen Gadol.
Wow.
That had been taken, at the time of Babylon. And they were drinking from the vessels of the Beis HaMikdash, right? Which was his statement, right? That it's finished now.
It's finished,
right?
yeah, for the Jews. Yeah.
Now, he had already, because of this letter, his response, by the way, the king sent back the following message: greetings to Rechem the rhetorician and Shimshai the scribe, and to the rest of your companions dwelling in Samaria and the other provinces beyond the river. The letter you sent me was read to me in translation. I ordered an investigation into the matter, and it has been found that this city has from the earliest times risen against kings, and the rebellion and insurrection have been rife in it. Powerful kings have ruled over Jerusalem and exercised authority over all the other provinces beyond the river, and tribute, poll tax, excise tax were paid to them. Immediately issue an order to stop these men. The city is not to be rebuilt unless I order it otherwise. Take care not to be lax in this matter, lest the treachery increase to where it harms the kingdom. So this was the response of the king, we believe it's Achashverosh, to the letter that was sent, and the building was stopped at that point. But back in the other capital, in Shushan, cut back to that story, right? They're having a party that went on for half a year, and then ended with a second feast that went on for 7 days, right? Some say that it ended on Yom Kippur, the last day of the feast was Yom Kippur. And he's wearing the clothes of the Kohen Gadol and serving drinks in the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash, which says he's come to the conclusion the temple will never be rebuilt, right? And that your place, Jews, is not over there. It's right where you are. You're in my kingdom. You're in my capital. You're serving me. This is what's right for you. When the Jews decided to go and take part in the feast, they said, yeah, you're right. They said, yes, you're right.
To impress them and to seduce them into believing.
Yeah, that's right. The first stage of the process really was seduction. I'm sending you a special invitation. We're making, we kosher the kitchens for you. All right?
It could be that they were, I wonder if the Jews at that time were also aware that the building of the temple, or it was the wall, was the temple first, right, was stopped. Because then maybe that would have made them also figure, maybe they would have, like you said, they probably had the same idea that, I guess everything's finished. Hashem's not with us anymore, and the temple's never going to be built, so why not enjoy ourselves now?
And nobody was coming from Eretz
might as well.
Israel to
Hashem's
collect.
not never going to be a temple again.
Yes, they were.
Well, they were disillusioned.
They were.
Disillusioned, yeah. So they said, okay.
They were trying to raise money.
What's the difference between today and then? Today people are coming to collect money.
It's not. What I'm saying is that, well, the truth of the matter is that today, Eretz Yisrael is.
It was until the next.
So I'm saying that today, Eretz Yisrael is, of course, much more prosperous than it was 100 years ago. People do still come to collect, but economically speaking, Eretz Yisrael is hard to compare to what it was 100 years ago. It's a miracle. But yeah, there was the tradition of coming to collect from the diaspora for the land of Israel is very ancient, very ancient, and of course in these days we can see from as I said later on in Nehemiah, it describes the terrible state people were in spiritually from a point of view of security and economically. The stores were open 7 days a week, right? 7 days a week because they were just trying to eke out a living, right? The children were, as I said, sold into slavery in order to feed other children.
But not in Persia.
What?
Haman's point was that in Persia, Jews were keeping the Shabbos.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They were actually more religious in Persia than they were in Israel, for sure. For sure. The communities were very Haredi in Persia at the time.
But maybe it was
so,
the reason just for preservation.
And what kind of community they have in Israel? Why in Israel they wouldn't keep Shabbos?
The community that was left in Israel was in a very tragic state. All of the spiritual leadership of the Jews were taken initially to Babylon. Remember, there was some 1,000 odd of the elite people were taken from in the initial exile to Babylon, where they set up yeshivas and where they created an environment so that when the rest of Israel was taken a few years later into exile, they actually came to communities that had shuls and had yeshivas and had mikvahs and everything you needed were already prepared for them in advance. But what the result was back in Eretz Yisrael, they were left without any spiritual leadership at all.
So
And
what?
there
The
was-
same we had in
They
Russia.
they had stopped speaking. They had stopped speaking the language.
And what did they
They
have
were-
in Egypt?
They were hang on for a second. They were marrying out in big numbers to the people who had been exiled to Israel from other nations, right? That had been sent to Israel to repopulate the country after the Jews were taken out by Sennacherib. So there was a huge problem with intermarriage. Nehemiah writes about it in detail. Even the Kohanim were intermarried at this point. It was very unfortunate. There's a famous Haftorah about the high priest's apron being covered in blood and filthy, and it's a reference to his children marrying out. So it was in Israel it was a very, very bad time, and until Koresh, started to begin a return, right? But it was not easy. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are a series of references that we have to really a very unfortunate situation in which it seems like the Jews of Persia don't have much of an interest. Right? It also seems that this statement that I just read to you from Ezra is another version of a statement that's part of the Megillah, right? And one of the things that should be noted is that when the Jews of Shushan talk about the Jews, they are concerned about all Jews, that all Jews will suffer at the hands of Haman, and this is their concern, right? Whereas the Jews of Israel are actually only concerned about their very difficult personal situation. So when Ezra writes, he writes about the suffering of this community trying to manage a very difficult situation. But when the author of the Megillah writes, we're always hearing about, the complexity of court intrigue and 127 provinces, of which, by the way, obviously, Israel is one of them. Right? But it's in a much grander perspective. But many of the events are the same. The Haman's decree, his description of the Jews as the people who don't respect your laws, is very similar to the letter that Ezra, interestingly enough, seems to have gotten his hands on, that was read in the court as well. One of the things that we should ask ourselves about this story, the story of Purim is a story that takes place over a very long period of time, more than a decade it goes on. And if you think for a moment, you might ask yourself, where should the story begin? Now imagine you don't know where it begins, right? It begins with Achashverosh's party, right? But is that really where it needs to begin? Could it begin, when Haman comes to power, right? When he's raised to power, right? What will we miss?
No, we need to have this beginning because the change of wives happening, of queens.
Why?
Which is,
Let's just say Haman comes to power and Esther's a queen. What do we have to know the story of Vashti?
it's a dramatic story.
It's a good story. Right?
Yeah.
For
I think it
television,
started when Ahasuerus became
How come they haven't made a
power.
movie yet?
He took power. Because who was Ahasuerus? He was looking after horses. And the Aman, who was the Aman? He was a barber. So
Right.
they just thought, if he can be, so I can be too. And then everything started.
But that's not where the story starts, right? Remember, you're raising a very good point, right? It could have started earlier, right? It could have started with the wedding of Vashti and Achashverosh. It could have started at the birth of Esther, or more likely, the death of her parents, when she becomes the...
she's a hero.
How she and Mordechai became together.
whatever, this is still unclear, but when she became his ward is the expression that's used, where he's responsible because her parents have died, right? So there are a lot of places where this story could have started, both beginning earlier, right? Your reference to Haman to Vashti is the only legitimate royal in the story, being the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, the daughter of Belshazzar, right?
Yeah, but he probably
Yeah.
took power, Nebuchadnezzar, much before he married Vashti. To marry Vashti,
You're talking about Achashverosh.
Achashverosh, excuse me. He married her just for one reason, just to legitimate his what he's doing.
Correct. So
It's not started with the
So
marriage.
it seems Achashverosh, as we understand him, was certainly not of royal blood.
Yeah.
Right? As you put it, we describe him as a stable boy,
Stable boy.
and Haman as a barber, right? But Vashti, right, is a legitimate royal.
Yeah.
She is the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, the daughter of Belshazzar, right? And she's Babylonian, right? For that reason. So the Babylonians were beaten. She is from a lost cause, right? She is royalty from one of the greatest emperors that ever ruled, the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, right? In terms of conquest, right? But a beaten emperor, right? Because Koresh conquered Babylon. Right?
She was
What?
the daughter of Belshazzar, right?
Yes.
Ironically, he's the one, the story of the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
little party also was drinking from some of the vessels
That's
of
right.
Hashem. So both times she finds herself in a situation where
That's right.
over
Well, although we don't know her role in that story.
no, but
She might have been quite young, right?
she was her father.
Yeah, her
She
father.
still
yeah.
had to pay a bit of a
Yeah.
price.
Yeah.
When you say the story, how it started, the story based on Megillah only.
Yeah, I'm saying from the Megillah's point of view.
Is there any other source which can confirm or whatever
So-
the same events? Are
so-
they reflected anywhere else?
So
besides
it's a good
Megillah?
question. It's a good question. The story, as we understand in the Megillah, has two possibilities. There are authors who describe the Megillah as a fanciful tale.
Fanciful?
Fanciful tale, not a fiction. A fiction that describes once again the Jews' survival and victory over their enemies. One of the problems with that view is the specificity of the story. There's a great deal of detail of dates and places in the story itself that leads one to believe that it's quite credible. But there are some big questions, right? For instance, the question of is Achashverosh Darius, Cambyses, Xerxes, or the term Artaxerxes, which is really like Pharaoh, meaning emperor of Persia. And it seems that there was, during this period of Persian emperors, 10 different emperors. We only mention a small number of them: Koresh, Darius, Achashverosh, and Darius II are the ones that we deal with, which raises a question we spoke about earlier: what happened to the reigns in terms of time of the other emperors? It's a question we'll come to. But the answer to your question is, like almost everything in the Torah, we have some details, like the Israelite charioteers that the Assyrians write about. Achashverosh, the name Achashverosh, appears in other documents as the name of an emperor, in Persian documents as well. Ezra and Nehemiah make a lot of references to this period of time in their writings. And they're going back and forth from Jerusalem to Persia at different times. It was a lot of travel back and forth. It's not that far.
But the fact that we have graves.
Yeah.
Of,
Esther's tomb is there.
Again, people will say Esther and Mordecai are purported to be buried there.
Yeah.
It's great.
We didn't
Yeah,
purport
tombs.
that they're there.
They're there. They're
No?
tombs. Even the Persians admit.
I understand, right? Well, first of all, they're not in Shushan.
It's like
right?
a Disneyland, you think? It's like a Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse?
No,
which
there,
not really.
the question of graves, right, and the accuracy of the graves in many situations are a question. Right? That is to say, they built a memorial to them.
Name of the city.
What is the name of the
It starts with a B. I don't know. I just read.
Where is actually? It's not Shushan.
I have
Where
to
is?
ask Nora Hilchik. She visited them when she was there.
Is it Azerbaijan that they're buried in?
No. It's when Nora. She's from Iran, and she's visited those tombs. And Iranians visit them. They know about the history. Part of their.
They say
Yeah,
it's
no, I
in
have it on
Iran,
kosher
but
too.
some people they say it's in Israel.
Right. Right. So
Would it be proof if you have a grave of a character?
They
And
say
it's
it's
a
in
Masorah.
Israel. Some people say it's in Israel. Some people say
No,
it's
it's not
in Persia.
Well, there's
not-
no
it's not
grave
in-
in
It's
Israel.
not in Israel.
Yeah,
Where?
there is I believe,
No, it's not.
near
Never heard that one.
Tveria somewhere.
No.
They say, they say they're buried there.
But even a grave, it is not confirmation of the whole story,
But it's
of
not
the narration.
true.
No.
And Iranian, they say we have the grave.
and there is a Iranian custom, a Persian custom, right? That Mordecai and Esther did exist, and it's not one of their favorite stories. But again, you could argue, well, they have that story from the Jewish community in Iran, right? So, in terms of, it seems that Darius II, who did encourage the Jews to go home, there's a very famous wall relief of him, carved into a wall, in which the Queen Mother is standing behind him. And that Queen Mother would have been Esther. That, according to our story...
There's a mural?
What? Yeah. It's
Of
not a mural, it's a
Relief.
carving into a wall.
Relief,
Right.
how do you call
Yeah.
it in English?
It's part of the records of
That
the...
would give us an insight to what they look like. Maybe a little bit.
Well, no, we have a lot... you mean into what
How
Esther
they
and...
actually looked.
They looked Persian, I suspect. You know, I mean, they were living in the court, so they would have dressed accordingly. Another problem with the history of it is that, unlike the Assyrians, the Persians did not keep such good records as the Assyrians did in terms of detail, and much of the history of Persia comes from the Greeks. Herodotus and a few other famous Greek historians, and they clearly made some errors in their calculations. For instance, they understood the name Artaxerxes to mean the name of an emperor, but it was the name of every emperor. Plus the emperor had their own name, right? So it would be King so-and-so, Artaxerxes so-and-so, right? So the sources of Persian history are not as good as they are of some other countries. And much of it comes from non-Persian sources. So there are...
You don't have to go too far. Canada means, or what is Toronto means meeting place.
Right.
And it wasn't long ago. You said Toronto, we have a name out of it.
Right.
While it means piece of, it's not a name.
Lots of Canadian names are just from the Aboriginal people.
Aboriginal people, but it wasn't even name of Aboriginal people. It meant something. It means it's a place of.
So
I want to make a statement about something, a little bit about the people of Shushan and Persia. It was a first exile. It reminds me a little bit like a first night of Adam Rishon. First night which came into the earth.
Yirmiyahu told them they would go home in 72 years. He told them that the temple would be destroyed, they would be exiled for 72 years.
It means
70.
they...
70?
70.
70, sorry.
It means my point that they just, they gave up because it was even it's thousands of years of exile, we know that we're going to be back because we've done it once. We came back once. You know what I'm trying to say?
They probably, in those days, they probably gave up. Yeah, and they probably thought 7 years was up and thought, by their calculations, and okay, nothing's happening.
Yeah, see, part of it was everybody calculated the 70 years from different starting points. Right? Was it from the exile of Babylon? Was it from the exile of the 10 tribes from Assyria? Was it the second exile to Babylon? They were all from different periods of time. Let me just pass this out to you. which is a little bit of a schedule. Maybe
Maybe can I ask you a question?
maybe Elena. Yeah. Yes.
The question, Vashti, she, like we were talking,
No.
said that she was of royal blood, and she was like,
Maybe Elena will
among all the
share.
other people, she was mostly like entitled to for royalty and everything.
Can't see anything.
So why Ahasuerus, who was not himself like he was like self-made or whatever, who made him a emperor or king, right? Ahasuerus. So why he, if she is a royal blood and everything, why, because she disobeyed him, why he killed her? Why he had to do that?
So, well, you raised a good question. Other sources deal with that. First of all, the reason we think that they would have married would be to the benefit of both of them. She was of royal blood of a failed monarchy, right? Babylon was a servant of Persia at this point. So, if you're of the royal blood of a country that doesn't exist anymore, there are people descended from the Tsar, right?
You'll be dead.
That, what?
Normal things, you should be dead. Best case scenario, you're captive and kept alive.
Yeah, but it doesn't, there was a time when, the Russian exiles, shortly after the revolution, had a certain kind of status in places like Paris and stuff like that. But, that disappeared relatively quickly. And certainly she may have been very beautiful, and she may have had a very good education, whatever. But she was the granddaughter of a country that didn't exist anymore. Right? So she didn't really have status. But she could add her benefit was, I'll marry the new emperor, right? And now I'm the empress again, right? His point of view was, okay, I'm a stable boy who made it, right? How do I put a little bit of shine on my throne, right? I'm going to marry the previous emperor's granddaughter, right? And it looks good, right? But I am in charge here at the end of the day. And at a certain point, he may have come to the conclusion of two things. One is, okay, it served its purpose. I have my legitimacy. I have my new capital. I'm having this huge feast. I'm tremendously powerful, right? And on top of it, she says no to me. Who says no to the emperor? Nobody says no to the emperor.
Death is the
right?
only way
What?
to do it. Death is the
It's
only
interesting.
way.
By the way, it's two things. Two things.
Or whatever.
Two things. First of all, we actually don't know that he killed her. We actually don't know it. We know that she was never allowed to see his face again,
Right.
and we conclude
That she was
that he killed her.
right.
Right? But we don't know that. Actually, it's not in the Megillah. You should know that. It's not in the Megillah.
Right.
That's an assumption we make.
And she disappears, right?
She disappears from the story.
Exactly.
But this happens in all melodramas. People disappear, right? So,
I understand.
there was a film, what's this very famous Vietnam film?
Killing Fields?
Saigon.
Killing
What was
Fields?
it?
No.
Goodbye, Saigon.
Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now. There were two fairly difficult actors that the director had to deal with. One was Marlon Brando, the other was Martin Sheen. And the director of the film told the props people, I want you to make me exact replicas of their heads, of these two people, right? And I want to make sure that they're aware that I have them. Martin Sheen and Marlon Brando. What was the purpose of it? At any point that he wanted to, he could kill them, right? And then continue the film. So if they got out of hand, like if they were hard to deal with, right? He could just, in the movie, rewrite the script. He had an alternative, right? And he would blow up their heads on camera, right? And then go on without them. And he wouldn't have to deal with actors who were giving him a hard time.
Right.
And the props people walked through the set on the first day carrying these heads, right? So Brando and Sheen saw them. They got the message, right?
Незаменимых нет.
Okay.
Yeah. So So this happens often in melodramas, and this is a melodrama.
Right.
By the way,
So Vashti, let me just
finish.
finish, right? So Vashti disappears from our story. We assume that she was killed, and part of it is that Memuchan, who we understand to be Haman, says to the king, look, if you allow this to happen, no man will have control of his house in all of Persia. If the queen doesn't obey the emperor, then you can't expect anybody. Now you have to do this for the men of the country, so to speak, right? And he was drunk at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
My point was very, very simple. Story was written, and Ahasuerus was alive. In a story, if you write the king just killed his wife, Ahasuerus might look at it as like, am I a killer, a drunk killer? No, in the story he was insulted. And
Again, you raise a very, very important point that we should never forget, is that the Megillah is not a historical document.
Mm-hmm.
It was the news of the day, right? Which is a very different thing. We don't see it that way. We see it as, the history of this great miracle that happened. But it was written the same year that it happened. So it was what we would call today a tell-all novel about the court, right? And if you're writing a tell-all novel about the court, it's better to do it after the emperor is dead than when you're going to his bedroom that night, or to his cabinet room if you're Mordecai to do it. It's a very unsafe kind of thing to do. Now, we understand Ahasuerus died very shortly after the story, in fact, and that Darius II became the next emperor. And it was Darius II who allowed the Jews finally to return.
It's the son.
What?
Esther's son.
Esther and Ahasuerus' son Darius, right?
So how
Darius
then
first
how
and
old
Darius
would Darius have been?
Second.
What?
How old would a Darius been?
It seems like he was very young at the time that Ahasuerus died. Maybe just under 10. It's a little unclear. And that's why the role of the Queen Mother is so important, right, at that point, which would have been Esther.
Right.
More than that, it's a curiosity, I've mentioned this before, is that we reckon the rule of Darius II, he is the only king outside of Israel who we reckon his rule from the first of Nisan. This is when we count the years of every Jewish king. It begins on the first of Nisan, the first day of the first month. With Darius II, it also happens, but not indefinitely. There's a certain point where the Gemara has determined that he is no longer such a good character, that he's turned into a bit of a Rasha. It's a story we'll get to later. And they start to reckon his reign not from Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Many people argue that it was after the death of his mother that things changed and his behavior changed. He was a good Jewish son until that
Esther
point.
lived for long years.
I don't think that long.
No,
I'm not sure.
not known.
I'm not sure how many years she lived after the story, but it wasn't 3 years.
Yeah.
It was substantial. So, if you look at the sheet that I passed out, you can see the different dates of events, right? And as you can see, if you look at the rebuilding of the temple, right, begins with Zerubbabel's return in 371 and is halted a year later in 370. Remember, before the Common Era, the years are going down. The numbers are going down, right? So it seems Ahasuerus in that year stopped the building. Right? And 3 years later, he had his banquet. And 4 years after that, Esther goes to the palace. So there's if you look at it, there's great spaces of time, right? Esther's not part of the story for, the first 5 years of Ahasuerus' reign, right? So the question is, what was the purpose of telling all of the backstory You know, now all of you have told additional backstories, right? That Haman was a barber, and that Achashverosh was a stable boy, and how it happened, and all these things are not part of the Megillah. And you might ask yourself, why didn't the Megillah begin that far back, or why didn't it begin, say, when Esther became queen, right? Mm-hmm. It seems the reason was the feast. Mm-hmm. It seems the reason was the feast. To understand, A, the opulence of Achashverosh, and B, this comparison of Jerusalem.
Humiliation.
The what?
I think the humiliation. They invited to the feast, and then they're humiliated.
Who's humiliated?
Jews. By what
not
they
at the
paraded.
beginning.
No. First they invited, and everything served to their liking and no pressure. And then they see that there is no future for them. It's a humiliation. There is no future for your independence or, sovereignty and whatever.
There's a fairly big passage of time between those two things. I think that
what
the
do you
reason...
mean, in the party?
Yeah. Between the party, remember what happens, right? First the party happens, right? Then Vashti is killed.
No, I'm actually talking about
Then
party.
years later, Esther becomes queen. And then after that, Haman makes his move.
No. When I say humiliation, imagine you're invited to the party. And they say everything going to be kosher, great, and you send menu. You walk in, and the Israeli flags are lying down on the floor, and you're supposed to step on it.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
The humiliation. You're invited to the party, to the king, and everything there talks to you. We're
Right.
drinking the holy things of the temple. Now we're drinking from it.
Right.
I'm wearing it as my,
Religion is dead. In other words.
religion is dead, future is dead.
Yeah.
You have nothing. You can have a nice drink of wine, but there is
No,
no.
you have everything, but it's here.
It's here,
That's what they're being
and whatever
told.
is holy for you, it's mundane for us.
But it's
Right.
not so much only humiliation only to the Jews. It's more everything related to Judaism and
Yeah.
to Jewishness, to everything.
Yeah.
It's not per se to people itself, but
Right.
it's the
No,
whole.
they were
thing.
allowed to exercise Jewishness. They
No,
were done
but-
with their
no,
own
but
state.
because-
That was
but
the
because
statement.
The because the vessels.
Well,
actually
actually,
was in
yours
their
makes yours making a very important point here.
It's
a
like a
very,
polite little thing,
it's a very important point, and it's also a lesson for us today.
What
Right.
are you saying?
Is that the humiliation was simply a statement that this is your home now. That build your life here, right? That a Jew who is a Persian has a good life. Gesund to hate,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
This obsession you have with Israel and the temple and your own nation and autonomy. Face the facts, right? I'm the emperor of 127 provinces. You're less than 1%, right? So just let it go, right? That was what his statement was. And interestingly enough, right, this is not a new statement to the Jewish people. The first thing that the Reform movement did when they built their system was take out the references to Israel from their davening. We are part of this world. We're Jewish. Make no mistake, right? But this thing with Israel, we don't have to have our synagogues face Jerusalem, right? It's not an issue, right? Well, we're still Jewish, no question about it, right? But, Zionism and this, let go of it already. You've been here for 1,800 years, except that's what it's going to be. You're not going back, right? You don't need it. You built a life without it, right? This is the statement. He was saying, your prophet said you're going back in 70 years. Now it's 2 years later, right? And, they're not building the temple anymore. That's finished, right? The vessels of the temple are part of everyday life for the emperor. This is the new capital, Birah, right? Shushan HaBirah, right? The only other reference to HaBirah in Tanakh is Jerusalem and the Beis Hamikdash, right? That's the only other reference, right? And the statement was, Shushan Habirat, Shushan is a replacement for you right, at this point. Yeah. So this was a statement that was being made, and I think you was right. I don't think it was a reference to Judaism. It was a reference to Zionism, in fact, at this point, curiously. And it was quite effective. I'm wondering if we should hold here. Okay, we'll hold here and pick up with the actual beginning of the Megillah. We kind of set where it's happened and why it begins where it begins.
Can I have this?
Yeah. Why it begins where it begins, and we're now going to look into the Megillah itself for additional references.